Muito boa noite, o meu nome é André Tavares, sou programador da Garagem Sul e tenho muito prazer em vos acolher aqui hoje para a primeira Conferência da Garagem de 2019 e também o Pier Paolo Tamburelli, que é quem vocês vieram ouvir. As Conferências da Garagem entram agora no terceiro ano de programação, já começa a ser um programa consolidado e fico feliz de ver a sala quente com o público que reconheço de algumas outras apresentações. Este ano tem um formato mais concentrado na época de primavera, hoje com a conferência do Pier Paolo Tamburelli, em abril o Oliver Wainwright, que vocês provavelmente conhecerão das críticas e recensões que escreve regularmente para o Guardian e que nos vem apresentar o interior da Coreia do Norte. Em maio, a Samia Eni, uma investigadora que publicou recentemente um livro que trata as questões da guerra colonial e da arquitetura na guerra colonial argelina, franco-argelina dos anos 50, 60 e, finalmente, em junho, já próximo do verão, teremos a arquiteta paisagista Catherine Mosbach, que vocês provavelmente poderão conhecer através da obra do Louvre de Lens, mais conhecida pela frente sana do que pela arquitetura paisagista que lhe dá enquadramento e também sentido. O Pier Paolo Tamburelli é arquiteto e tem trabalhado como membro ativo do coletivo baukuh de Milão, que tem conquistado uma relevância cada vez maior no panorama internacional, europeu em particular, mas também lecionando em Chicago, tendo passado por Harvard, e também foi membro fundador da revista San Rocco, que nos últimos anos tem sido um dos principais agitadores intelectuais enquanto veículo em que uma nova geração de arquitetos se tem atrevido a pensar e a desafiar alguns padrões estabelecidos da arquitetura contemporânea e, a partir desses desafios, encontrar sentido e orientação para a sua própria prática de projeto. E, neste sentido, creio que é um conferencista que vem dar o sentido que nós pretendemos a estas conferências da garagem, em que a arquitetura é essencialmente vista como uma forma de pensamento, um pensamento que conduz ao desenho e à ação. Por isso, é com grande prazer que acolho aqui hoje Pier Paolo. Pier Paolo, sorry to have spoken in Portuguese, but the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, I unfortunately will not speak Portuguese. First of all, I would like to thank Andre and also a little bit the community here in Lisbon that always welcomes me. So thank you all. I will speak mainly about the book by an Austrian Baroque architect called Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach. And I would try to speak about these as a starting point for a potential research on certain aspects of contemporary architecture. So the argument will be built a little bit slowly, and the work of Fischer and also the proposal for the research will be seen in the light of our, let's say, postmodern, not in the sense of postmodern, but just after modernism condition. Let's start from these two things. These two things are I believe, very rarely coming in the same conversation. These two things are the Weissenhof-Siedlung in Stuttgart and the Mount Rushmore in South Dakota. But these two things happen to have been built starting in the same year. So in 1927, while Mies van der Rohe, Jeppe Hout, de Martstam, and so forth were building this exhibition in this world fair in Stuttgart, Getzenborgum was starting to explode the boulders of the Black Hills of South Dakota in order to sculpt these four gigantic portraits of Jefferson, Roosevelt, Lincoln, and Washington. Now, these two things never come in the same conversation. Like when we speak about architecture, we speak about one, and when we speak about something else, maybe pop culture, maybe monumentality, also movies, because there's been sectors of let's say, the culture of the last 100 years who have been busy with this, also in a quite sophisticated way. Just think of Alfred Hitchcock's North by Northwest. But when we talk about these two things, they don't come in the same conversation. And these, so the picture to the right seems not to belong to the discussion about contemporary architecture. And these, even if actually, if we would consider these two things according to the principles of classical architecture, these would perfectly fit. So my idea is that at a certain moment, something happened for which the Mount Rushmore that could have been at the core of the discipline of architecture, according to Vitruvius, Bernini, and so forth, started to somehow be pushed away and forgotten. Now, I think we can approach this thing starting from an observation that Wittgenstein made while reading Fraser's Golden Bough. And Wittgenstein writes that it's possible to begin a book on anthropology in this way. When we watch the life and behavior of man all over the earth, we see that apart from what we might call animal activities, taking food and so forth, men also carry out actions that bear a peculiar character and might be called ritualistic. Now, Wittgenstein does the very Wittgensteinian thing of defining very precisely something and saying there is this something and then there's something else. And it's very clear that he is interested in the something else, but it keeps on speaking about the something. I think architecture can also be classified this way. And the modern architecture, starting from Logier's essay of 1753, decided that it was important to start talking about these animal activities, activities that could be measured, that could have a very clear description, and that could rather precisely correspond to a certain architecture. So it was possible for Logier to write a function, and I think functionalism is much more to be understood in this manner, like that something is the function of something else, than not so much an excessive attention to certain practical needs. And the more ritualistic part of the ritualistic activities could slowly start to fade away. Those ritualistic activities, like things associated to public representation of power, to religious rituals, and so on, have been at the core of the discipline of architecture until this break. And these series of, let's say, gestures, behaviors, did not disappear in contemporary world. I will show at the end a little bit. But architecture somehow decided not to care anymore about those things. Now, if we look at the origin of this paradigm shift, and here I'm saying something very banal, is Logier's essay that appears in 1753. This is quite interesting because Logier, and so the architectural debate that normally comes, that we are used, that architectural debate comes so much after other discipline, in that case came much before. So the Wealth of Nation by Adam Smith is 1775, so it's 20 years after. And Logier operates this radical reduction that I think is very clear if we confront the engraving that goes together with the second edition of Logier, that is 1755, I think. And this engraving of 1521 that goes together with the first edition, no, not the first edition, but the edition of Cesariano of Vitruvius that appears in Como in 1521. Now, I think the thing gets even more clear if we read the famous beginning of the book of Logier, just the very beginning. Let us consider man in his first origin without any other help, without other guide than the natural instinct of his wants. He wants an abiding place. Near to a gentle stream, he perceives a green turf, the growing verdure of which pleases his eye. Its tender down invites him. He approaches, and softly extended upon this enameled carpet, he thinks of nothing but to enjoy in peace the gifts of nature. Nothing he wants, he desires nothing. But presently the sun's heat, which scorches him, obliges him to seek a shade. And then the story goes on. It's an unbelievably boring story in the sense that it misses the fundamental thing for any story. It misses characters. The primitive man of Logier is desperately alone, and his only problems are meteorological problems. Rain, too much sun, blah, blah, blah. Now, if we consider this theory of architecture, where Logier operates this radical simplification, that is, gets rid of all other characters, and man is completely alone, only with natural resources and meteorological problems. If we compare that to a classic, also a little bit generic story, like the one of Vitruvius, the beginning of book second, and we see it in Cesariano's description, it's very clear that there are characters, that there's no discussion of the origin of architecture, because the discussion is a discussion about the origin of the city. And the city is plural from the beginning. And in Cesariano, picture is already clear there are issues associated with language, with politics, with violence. You see one of these men who carries a stone. You see the semi-naked woman and a little bit too old kid approaching her breast, and all of these complications in Cesariano's image, that is an image that I personally like a lot. We use it always. It was on the cover of a book we made. But I think it's such a great picture. It's such a great picture because it clarifies this idea that architecture, according to classical theory, started already as a complicated thing. It started as a plural, complicated thing, contrary to the story of Loger that invents a simple, uncomplicated beginning. Of course, the Loger story is based on, like the primitive man of Loger is the same as this other primitive man, that is Robinson Crusoe, the protagonist of this book by Willem Dafoe, that is a fake primitive man because it's absolutely liberal, like it's a liberal subjectivity of the 18th century. Now, the critique of these mythological version of the primitive times have been developed already in the 20s, like Marcel Mauss, and then Karl Polanyi, and then Marshall Sahlins. So there's nothing new in that, like the story of the theory of Adam Smith about primitive exchange, that primitive man A meets primitive man B, and one has too many rabbits and the other has too many chickens, and they exchange rabbits for chicken. It's nonsense, because primitive tribes exchange as groups, as society, and not as individuals. So this critique has been quite extensively developed in anthropological discussion and also in economical discussion. In architectural discussion, I think we didn't discuss this thing so much, except for a minoritarian tradition, I think, that is made of a few episodes, like late Gideon, late Le Corbusier, although never really expressed, except for architecture project, but of course also Adolf Loos, and I believe the most systematic attempt of producing a consistent critique of functionalism and of modernism that would, I think, imply an overall critique of it. That's also the reason why this book, I think, is so important, because it's not trying to amend modernism. This book is trying to provide a new foundation for architecture. And of course, the book that I think corresponds to the book before, it's kind of a prosecution of the project, also quite literal in certain things. Now, if we look from this point of view, I think we can try to look at a book that Fischer von Erlach publishes in 1721 that is titled the Entwurf einer historischen Architektur, so the project of historical architecture. Now, in order to understand this, I think we need to understand a little antefactum that is related to the personal history of Fischer, because Fischer in the late 1670s, as a student, as a relatively young and relatively bad son of a relatively bad sculptor, goes to Italy to learn a job that at the beginning was sculpture, and then, like any failed sculptor or painter, then became architecture. So Fischer goes to Rome in the late 1670s, stays for 10, 15 years, and sees the twilight of the career of Gian Lorenzo Bernini. That is the person in this picture. This is a self-portrait of the young Bernini, but the Bernini that Fischer probably knew is this man. And in particular is this man after a very unhappy trip to Paris to design the Palace of the King of France, the Louvre. Indeed, in 1665, the Pope, that at the time I think is Alexander VII, but I might be wrong, loses some sort of pseudo-war or makes some sort of mistake. And in order to recover his relation with the King of France, sends his architect, that at the time is quite old, Bernini is 66, sends his architect, who at the time is the biggest artistic celebrity in the Western world, something in, I think Bernini at that time is something in between Rem Koolhaas and Madonna today. So it's like in a known mass society is the maximum celebrity you can think of. So the King of France is very ambitious, Louis XIV, who at the time is 26, so it's very young, he will still be the King of France for 50 years, wants the fanciest possible architect. So he wants Bernini. So these are the characters: Bernini, 66, Louis XIV, at the time, 26, and Jean-Baptiste Colbert, at the time, 45. Now, the story is narrated, and of course also the other characters, Charles Perrault and Claude Perrault, a little bit older, a little bit younger than Colbert. Bernini is supposed to design fundamentally this thing here, the so-called cour carrée, and this facade that here you see in what is then the project by Claude Perrault. Bernini does two projects once when still in Italy, trying not to go to Rome, to Paris. And the story is reported in a very beautiful book written by Monsieur de Chanteloup, who was one of these mediators of the time, who tried, like he was a representative of the so-called Italian artistic party at the court of France, and tries to bring Bernini to Paris. So this is the second project. Then there's no way. Bernini wants to remain in Rome because he has to finish his commission, that at the time is St. Peter's Square, that he built for Alexander VII, that is this Pope portrayed by Bernini himself on his deathbed. So the two guys, not only the architect, but they had a strange sense of humor. And the trip by Bernini is an absolute failure. The story starts like Bernini dislikes Paris in all its manifestation, despises everybody, goes to see the collection of paintings and says, this is a fake, this is a fake, this is a fake, and devalues them like of, let's say, 3/4 of the value. The story starts in an incredibly clumsy way when Bernini arrives in Paris. Colbert goes to pick him, goes to visit him in the house that the king gave to Bernini, and arrives like at 3 in the afternoon, and the servant, the butler of Bernini says, you know, you cannot see the Cavaliere Bernini because he's sleeping, he's doing his siesta. And Colbert says, you know, I'm the Prime Minister of France. And the butler say, you know, no way. There's no way he's not gonna do his siesta. So then they have this super idiotic compromise for which Colbert can enter the room of Bernini, provided the room remain in complete darkness and Bernini remains in the bed. And that's the first meeting of the star architect and the Prime Minister of France. Now the story then goes on. It's it's very, in a way, it's also very sad. Bernini does two things. This is the portrait of Louis XIV, one of the most amazing portraits in the history of sculpture. And this project is amazingly interesting project, in my opinion, in which Bernini is capable of somehow merging the typology of the castle and the typology of the palazzo and somehow annihilating both and creating these extremely, how to say, ambitious and glorious stage that at the same time is totally laconic for the glory of the king, that is developed through different stages. But through the discussion, Colbert and Perrault constantly ask Bernini sort of functionalistic, modernistic questions, like where will the fireman enter? Where will the weapons be stored? Will the fire happen if this is made? And to all these questions, Bernini answered things like, I don't care. This is a nonsensical question. And not because he's just arrogant, because he's very arrogant, but also because he gives back answers that are actually more rational than the question. It says, I've been working for popes for 45 years, and I know that in a palace of this size, every time there's a new pope, there's a new arrangement of rooms. So to stick to functions is rather stupid, because you will rearrange everything. So it's really a conversation in between two people who don't share the same line of argument, and they never manage to speak. To the point that when Bernini presents at the end, like Bernini stays from, I believe, from March, April to October. So it stays like 6-7 months in Paris. At the end, he presents these project. This is the side elevation, so the elevation towards the river, toward the Ile de la Cité. This is, I believe, it's really an amazing contextual, like strangely contextual drawing for this massive palazzo that at the same time, for all the contempt that Bernini proclaimed towards French architecture, is capable of finding this relation with the pavilions by Lescaut, and that is also capable of organizing these different back and forth of this facade in a way as to, I think, establishing a relation with the river, with the fact that there's flowing water there. In a way, I think this, that is, to a certain extent, the back elevation is very similar to the back elevation of the Rijksbank by Mies van der Rohe, the back towards the Spree, where, again, there are these three elements that somehow establish a relation with the flow of the wood. So in front of this masterful composition, like something really impressive, Claude Perrault has the very bad idea to say that this thing is not symmetric, so it's wrong. At that point, Bernini starts to shout at him and say, Bernini doesn't speak French, so he shouts at them in Italian and say, what the fuck, who's this idiot I should answer to? And leaves the room, starts to cry. It's a super emotion. Bernini was from Napoli, was very theatrical, very, well, sorry, I say it with a lot of sympathy, but so he was really, so he shows all of his contempt, leaves the room, says he wants to go back to Italy and so forth, and the thing fundamentally collapses. It collapses also because Louis XIV at a certain moment decides to move to Versailles, so to leave the capital for political reasons, and only many years after the colonnade by Perrault will be built. Now, I think this moment is like moment of confrontation, although Bernini is not a theorist, is not fighting for an argument, is more fighting for a praxis, for a way of doing architecture, not really for principle. But I think in this episode, and particularly in the conversation with Colbert, that is, if you read the Chanteloup journal, is the smartest of all the opponents of Bernini, and I think here there's really a paradigm shift in the making, the paradigm shift that then becomes very evident with Laugier. Fischer von Erlach studies in Rome in this moment, in a rather crepuscular moment, which the great season of the Italian Renaissance and then of the Italian Baroque somehow collapsed because the trip of Bernini in France was undeniably a defeat, a cultural defeat, and Rome is also no more the center of cultural production of Europe. And that's exactly the moment in which this happens. And so Fischer studies there. I think the book is a little bit the consequence of that, although the book is entirely produced in 1712, although it is published in 1721. I think this book still refers to the discussion in Rome like 20 years before. Fischer produces all of this book that, as you will see, have very little text and a lot of drawings like this, but we will go back. Produces this book, all of the drawings except, I believe, two, in 1712. In 1712, a king, actually an emperor, that I believe was Joseph II maybe, or Charles the whatsoever, the emperor dies. And the problem for Fischer is that it's not only that that he was the architect of the emperor, but also that he had very personal relation to the emperor because he taught architecture to the emperor when he was a young prince. Because actually at the time the only ways to spend public money was either war or buildings, so even the emperor needed to know something about architecture. So Fischer is in a deep crisis because the king that would have been his client for life dies relatively all of a sudden, and more than this, the new king, that again is the other one, either Charles or Joseph, whatever, the new king has given employment before to his biggest rival, I don't remember him now, the architect of the Upper Belvedere. It's not Dientzenhofer, it's, yeah, I don't remember. So it's a very critical moment for Fischer, and like any unemployed architect in the history of architecture, Fischer started to make drawings, and he brings the drawings to the new king. He is confirmed in his position as the architect of the emperor, so he immediately forgets about the drawings, and then published them, only much later, 10 years after. The thing is published in 1721. And as you can see here, there's a title. The title is Entwurf einer historischen Architektur. That means a project of a historical architecture in Abbildungen unterschiedenen berühmten Gebäude. So in representation of various famous buildings, but this is important. So these berühmten Gebäude, the famous building, are des Altertums, so of the antiquity, und fremder Völker. So the research is a research that goes down in time, in antiquity, but also in space. It addresses also foreign population. This is quite important, and it's quite important, the title. The title, again, is Project of a Historical Architecture. So this is not an architectural history. The book is not about architectural history, it's about historical architecture. This means that contrary to a modern narration, to a historicist modern narration, in which the link in between the zeitgeist, the spirit of the time, and architecture is given, and what changes is only the spirit of the time. So history of architecture is like history of the art or history of philosophy. It's just chasing the spirit of the time in its different manifestation, but the relation between the spirit of the time and architecture is constant, so that it's possible to write a history, the history of the evolution of this character, the spirit of the time in architecture. Fischer is interested in exactly the opposite, in the historical architecture. So this link is not given. This link is different in different population, in different moments, and the thing is that the story of Fischer is not a uniform story. It doesn't even go in chronological order. It's totally fragmented, the subject of this narration. But at the same time, the relation in between a certain civilization and its own architecture is not given, is problematic, is what Fischer tries to investigate. So there's a tendential comparativism in the Entwurf. The Entwurf is subdivided into 5 books. We will only speak about 3. The 4th is about project by Fischer, and the 5th, for some reason, is about vases, like strange vases. The first book is dedicated to Jewish, Egyptian, Syrian, Persian, and Greek architecture. Book 2 is fundamentally dedicated to, and we will see there's always exceptions. Book 2 is fundamentally dedicated to Roman architecture, and book 3 to Chinese, Siamese, Persian, and Ottoman architecture. Now, the book is published in German and French. Fischer writes these in collaboration with a very strange figure, a Swedish intellectual of the time called Carl Gustav Ereus, who ended very badly because he was the responsible of a collection of medals of the Emperor of Austria, and at a certain moment decided to steal some medals. So his career came to a relatively bad ending. But what is interesting here is the extreme accuracy of Fischer. You see, maybe in the French edition it's more clear. You see, this is the text. There's relatively little text, but there are all these quotes of the sources of the documentation that Fischer put together in order to produce his drawing. And you see, he quotes Cassiodione, Herodotus, Apollonius, blah, blah, blah again, Herodotus, Diodorus Siculus, Livius. So it's quite precise. And the drawing have very detailed captions. These are the captions of the Mecca engraving, describing the mosque at Mecca. And you see the precision of all these places. La pierre où a secondi l'ange Gabriel avoir été. So the stone where the Archangel Gabriel was. So Fischer collects Walter Benjamin once wrote in his book about the German Trauerspiel that the Baroque doesn't explore the world but the library. I don't know if it's true, but it's certainly true for Fischer, that actually doesn't really move so much from Vienna, but collects all possible reports from ambassadors and gets information about China, information about Turkey, information about Persia, and puts together this book. So this is the page that summarizes the all of the building included in a book one. It's quite interesting that there is these, this exists only for book one, but at least for book one, there's a map of all the things. So the things are precisely placed on a map. On the contrary, the buildings are not placed in a timeline, in a chronology. Of course, this thing was rather complicated in 1721. We're exactly in the moment in which European intellectuals start to have doubt about the fact that the world is 4,000 years old, but they still don't have a clear idea about how old it could be. It's a moment in which the discussion, the interpretation of the Bible that becomes much more precise and scientific, like the calculation of the origin of the world has been done by Isaac Newton, who actually defended this idea that the world is 4,000 years old and calculated it extremely precisely. This debate on, let's say, biblical science goes together with a debate on fossils, the discovery of these marine animals, bones of marine animals into mountains that created very strange theories. There's some Jesuits saying that the fish have been brought there by the wind, or very, very bizarre theory. So it's super complicated. It's also not very safe to say something. I mean, in Austria, it's an extremely Catholic country at that time. It's not so safe to really speak about a chronology of the world. And Fischer, here and there, mentions certain dates. He uses also, for very ancient building, uses the expression age of the war, year of the war, 3000 something, but in general doesn't define something like this. And that's another proof that the book doesn't try to be a history of architecture. Now, the book starts with Temple of Solomon that is entirely based on the book by Villalpando, the commentary on Ezekiel. The Temple of Solomon is the only, one of the two buildings. The other one is the Palace of Diocletian in Split that is represented with two images. But immediately after these, immediately after Temple of Jerusalem, that might have suggested a Unitarian source. And the Villalpando book stresses that approach to the history of architecture, so saying that everything was already given in the Temple of Jerusalem. On the contrary, Fischer simply moves on and moves to a thing that I believe is the core of his project. So this is the Hanging Garden of Babylon. So the pyramid, the statue of Zeus in Olympia, a mausoleum of Halicarnassus, Temple of Diana in Ephesus, a Colossus of Rhodes, and lighthouse at Alexandria. That means the so-called seven wonders of the ancient world. The seven wonders of the ancient world have a very interesting characteristics. That is, that the seven wonders are seven. So they are plural. They are a set that can potentially be infinitely expanded. Contrary to the primitive art, that is one, and that is ideal and very practical also, the seven wonders are actually real. The seven wonders were built. Maybe these versions are a bit fantasizing, but the seven wonders are something about which we can get realistic information. And Fischer is extremely accurate in trying to obtain that. They're real, they are ritualistic, and they're also seven. So they produce, they provide a set that can be, in principle, expanded. So then Fischer goes on. This is from a medal in the collection of Bellori, so back to Rome 30 years before. This is this one I don't remember. These one are the Nile waterfall, like the waterfalls that don't exist anymore because of the Aswan Dam. And this is quite interesting because actually this is not a building. This is part of the collection of Fischer, but there's actually no building. I think this builds on an implicit definition of architecture by Fischer that is actually just the fixation of the link in between a place and a certain cultural interpretation of the place, a certain ritual, a certain set of gesture that is associated with a spot on this planet. And this is enough, this cultural operation is enough to produce architecture, even in the absence of built infrastructure. This brings us back to a picture we saw before, much before. That is this. This is Niagara Falls in a painting by Gerhard Richter. And actually, I think Richter tries to paint the same thing that Fischer wants to fix, the creation of this link in between cultural interpretation of a place and that same place. And this operation on collective imagery is enough to produce, in their opinion, architecture. And architecture here is clearly defined as a technology of memory. Like architecture is something that relates a certain cultural content to a place so that it can be somehow stored and deposit and reused in the future. But it's something fixed. And this fixation that normally happens by building walls or columns and so forth, in this case, is just much more simple. And it's just, let's say, a cultural interpretation of an element of landscape. I don't know if I have the picture. Yeah. If I learn how to use this thing. It's exactly the same thing. No. I think that's, yeah. It's exactly the same thing that happens with this thing here. This is a mountain in Wyoming that's called Devil's Tower. That is the place where the aliens land they land there in Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And the aliens broadcast in the mind of poor Richard Dreyfuss the picture of this thing, and he starts to be obsessed and builds this gigantic model, I think, of mashed potatoes in his living room. This thing, in this context, is architecture. It's not a mountain. It's something that has a very precise interpretation and that can be used to, let's say, accumulate this cultural interpretation to make it shared. Okay. So Fischer goes on in his collection that we now see backward. With the labyrinth in Crete, the statue of Alexander the Great that has actually never been built, but it's just part of a story at the beginning of Book 2 by Vitruvius, that I don't need to mention, that looks so much like Mount Rushmore, and gives an idea how much Mount Rushmore lies at the core of the architectural discipline. And this is Book 1. Book 2 starts with a Roman architecture. These things are near, like an aqueduct near Tunis that the Habsburg just conquered. So there's also these back and forth with, let's say, contemporary news. And then Augustus Bridge, the Domus Aurea, several arches, the Naumachia, the Trajan Forum. You see, it's a very strange collection of Roman buildings because, for instance, there's no Colosseum, so there's no... Some things that are very known are also forgotten. There's no systematic plan in this book. Diocletian bath and so forth, and you see this is the split palace that you see again. It's two pictures. It's very episodic on certain decision, and always the buildings are described in these pseudo-axonometric perspectives, so they are seen from the outside. It's always relatively precise in describing the relation with landscape, that maybe it's a fantasy landscape, but at least Fischer tries to locate the building in a certain context. This Palmyra, again, from the expedition of some, I believe, Swedish explorer who went to Palmyra at the time. Then, out of the blue, Stone Age, that Fischer might have visited, because at a certain moment he went to England. Sedlmayr fantasizes of a meeting in between the very old Christopher Wren and Fischer von Erlach that I think, I'm sad to say, it probably never happened, but the Isola Bella on Lake Maggiore, and then a collection of Ottoman mosque, Mecca, Hagia Sophia, the Mosque of the Prophet in Medina, Isfahan, Mazar-e-Shan, the Forbidden City, whatever else, bridges in China, and so forth. Now, when I wrote this thing about Fischer that I'm now quickly telling you, I tried to systematize this thing with the help of some collaborators, and we started precisely writing down all of the quotes, calculating all the little people, all the little animals in the engravings. This is a little bit the result of that, but let's skip. Now, why looking at this thing? Why looking at this book that certainly interesting, but might look like a little bit out of fashion? These are, this book can be interesting in order to observe the landscape in which we live, in which there are still very strange objects related to mass events that received almost zero attention in the architectural debate of the last 250 years. Nobody went to places like Lourdes, nobody went to Fatima, nobody went to Mount Rushmore, nobody went to a series of places that actually exist in contemporary world. So a couple of years ago in Chicago, I tried to make a catalog of things. It's very difficult to make a catalog of these things because it's very difficult. You are immediately confronted with the same problem of Fischer of defining criteria for these known animal activities, like these ritualistic activities, and you are again in the same problem of Wittgenstein. It's easy to classify what you're not interested with. And you can only classify what you're interested with known what I'm not interested with. But anyhow, so these are some attempts done with the students in certain cases. Also design exercise, like understanding the rituality of certain places and redesigning them entirely, as Fischer would have done, actually Fischer redraws all these places, starting from, let's say, relatively accurate sources, but then he redraws them entirely from his point of view, from the background of a classicist architect of the early 18th century. So we did something similar. These are certain theses developed at Politecnico in Milan. This is Lourdes. It's not so important now. This is again Mount Rushmore. What is more interesting, I think, in the context of this short conversation is this map of places around the world that at least can come into a conversation of contemporary wonders. This is a provisional list. And there are things like, I don't know, Indianapolis Speedway or Lourdes, or this is it's a place for a specific procession in Manila that is, I don't remember the name. This is a picture of Kumbh Mela in India. These are rock-cut churches in Cairo on the Mokattam Hills. So this church has been built in the 70s. That means that it's an amphitheater against a cave. The cave has been digged with the bulldozer, and the bas relief dedicated to the Virgin Mary that you see there have been sculpted with the, I don't know the word in English, with the disc that you use to cut, with the grinder, okay? Amazing space, by the way. It's on Mokattam Hill, that is the place where the Zabalin lives. The Zabalin are the cleaners, the people who recycle the trash of Cairo. They are part of the Coptic minority, so they are Christian. This is a copy of St. Peter built in Côte d'Ivoire, in a city whose name I cannot remember. Yeah, and I think we can maybe conclude here. I believe there is a potential to go and look at those places, and by looking at those places also to acquire maybe an understanding of contemporary architecture that is a little bit more open-minded and that can address certain questions that might seem stupid, but that come again and again in conversation about contemporary architecture, like the incapacity to produce really monumental architecture, the incapacity to design a proper church or something like that. And I think it's possible to have a look at all those places, simply because these places are actually huge, and there are maybe days in which there's millions of people going there. So that's, to me, a reason enough to tackle these topics. Thank you.
Algumas pessoas já estarão com a fome a apertar, mas ainda temos algum tempo para fazerem perguntas em inglês, ou em italiano, ou em português, breves, que eventualmente possam esclarecer algumas hipóteses que aqui foram levantadas. I'm opening the stage for questions, if there are any.
Good evening. Thank you for the talk. I would like to know if you could develop a bit more the concept that architecture is a technology of memory, and in the end, like when you showed in the book of Fischer, some projects are not realized, but they function already as a technology of memory, like the statue of the Alexander the Great, and somehow, what is the relation between the project and the physicality of an architecture in this technology of memory sense?
Well, it's not so simple. I use the expression technology of memory, but maybe we can oppose to something like, I don't know, technology of shelter. So for Logier, architecture is a technology of shelter. You protect people from rain, from heat, from cold, and so forth. And that's also fundamentally an architecture whose fundamental piece is the roof. This is also the theory of Alberti, for instance. And I think an architecture that is mainly, because it's different to separate the two things, that's mainly a technology of memory, is maybe an architecture is more imposing certain paths, certain gestures, more an architecture of walls than an architecture of a roof. But again, the large majority of buildings we know have both a roof and a wall, so it's not so a clear-cut distinction. I think the expression technology of memory is to try to address the fact that there can be an intentionality in producing memory, and this intentionality has been extremely present in classical architecture, but still is present also, and at least in part, in contemporary architecture. And in certain cases, it's a very conscious decision to produce architecture for the sake of fixing something. Not so much, I think, well, this would be a very complicated discussion, but not so much in remembering some idea, but in creating the special condition for the repetition of certain behaviors, certain gestures. I think this is very clear in Roman architecture, in the relation of Roman religion to Roman architecture, but that would, let's say, start a complicated conversation about the fact that Roman religion is fundamentally an orthopraxis, and so it's much more about repeating certain rituals than really being confronted with a theology or a mythology, and that generated probably the very special link that is established in between a certain landscape, a certain architecture, and a certain religion in the case of the Romans. That is a very special case. I would probably even say that the way we think about architecture, like I think Adolf Loos was right, like the Romans defined the way in which we think about architecture. And it might even be that this way of thinking about architecture that I'm so linked to is probably a bit outdated. And it's probably not in tone with contemporary civilization anymore. But again, it's quite a complex subject that's kind of opening up a little bit too many paths. But yeah, I don't know if I.
With me to ask, when you design architecture as an architect does, isn't it?
Yeah.
What an architect does. How much this kind of pulse for rituals that you are describing?
Zero or almost zero, in the sense that we design, I don't know, last building we built is a shop to sell beer inside of a brewery. I mean, there's not that much rituality there. I don't believe in a point-to-point connection in between architectural practice and theoretical work. For sure, there's a link, but I'm pretty happy if this link is very indirect and there's no immediate translation of one into the other. And I would also think it never proved particularly successful to try to link these two things too strictly. So, yeah,
Good.
I think there's a link, but I don't know.
Thank you. Some more questions? Or can we thank you again for coming here and sharing with us Fischer von Erlach and the marvels of the modern world. Thank you, Pier Paolo.
Thank you.